I think that all Jews are survivors of the Holocaust, because after all, Adolf Hitler's plan was to annihilate every single one of the Jews. And so I think that just as all of us have to understand that we too came out of Egypt, we have to understand that all of us came out of Auschwitz. And that understanding should in fact inform our actions and our lives, all the days of our lives. And as Mrs. Lux Brown has done so valiantly for us and also for her family, we must teach it to our children and ensure that they teach it to their children, because it is only through the knowledge of what we have gone through as Jews and persevered as Jews that we will ensure our future as Jews. I think it's important for us to realize that the Shoah only ended when the Allies won their war against Germany. And as a consequence, because it went on for so long, the Jewish people were the biggest losers of World War II. Not the Germans, not the Japanese, it was the Jewish people. We lost a third of our members. No other nation lost as much in World War II as the Jews. We didn't win the war, we lost it. And it's important for us to remember that so that we understand well what happened to us and how to prevent it from happening again. The Jewish people have lots of different responses to the Holocaust, a lot of different ways of looking at it. But I think that it's important, first of all, to think about how the Allies thought about the Holocaust if we are to really understand what responses we needed, what responses we still need today when we recognize that every single one of us is a survivor of the Holocaust. When I say that in the end the Shoah ended when the Allies beat the Germans, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the Americans and the British didn't do anything to stop the destruction of the Jewish people in Europe? They could have done a lot. They could have ended it. The Hungarian Jews, survivors who lit the candles this evening, and so many more of them, the annihilation of Hungarian Jewry was essentially carried out before the version in those days of the evening news. Everybody knew it was happening. Everybody knew about the deportations to Auschwitz. It was happening on prime time. Could have been stopped. Why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz? Why? Why didn't they bomb Birkenau? Why? The answer is twofold, I would think. The first reason is that they didn't think that it was in their interest to do so. They were fighting a war, a big war against the Germans, who they considered threatened them. They were doing it for themselves, not for us. They were doing it because they rightly assessed that a German victory would destroy their way of life in Britain, and in America, and in the rest of the world. But they didn't have a stake in the survival of the Jewish people, they didn't think, and they didn't think that there was any reason, when they're in the midst of such a massive war effort, to divert any resources to save people who weren't part of their army. That was their right to think that. We can be angry about it, and we can think that and rightly judge them to have failed morally in the test of their times, and that's true. But they had a rational view of the world, and it was what informed their decisions, and they also had another thing, which I think we shouldn't ignore, which is, at best, an indifferent opinion of the Jewish people, and probably more honestly, they didn't like us very much. So, and these were the Allies. Of course, we know that the nations of Europe, most of them, were only too happy to collaborate with the Nazis. The largest percentage of a Jewish population that was destroyed by the Nazis was actually in Holland, where you had massive collaboration with the Nazis on the part of the locals. But in most of the European nations, the people that were defeated, occupied by the Nazis, didn't have any problem collaborating with the Nazis in their joint project of sending the Jews to the gas chambers. So the Allies didn't think it was in their interest to save the Jews, and they didn't like us very much. So they didn't save us. And so in the end, The camps were only liberated when they defeated the German army on their terms in their time. So after they did that, and thank them very much for doing so, but they did us no favors, the Jewish people, the survivors, and the survivors who directly survived, and the rest of them who had never directly felt the weight of the German war machine on their backs, came up with a lot of different conclusions about what the Holocaust meant for the Jews, what behavior that crime against us, first and foremost, taught us about how we should behave in the world. And I think that it's worth considering two of them. There were two sort of schools of thought amongst the Jews about how to deal with what had just happened. The first one was outward looking. It said the problem with the Holocaust was that people didn't feel obligated to prevent it or from stopping it, ending it in the middle. Roosevelt didn't feel that he had to stop it. There was no way to force him to do it. There was no way to force him to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz. There was no way to get him to bomb the gas chambers, and so he didn't. We have to change the law. We have to change the way that people look at the goals of war by changing the law. If we change the law, then people will be forced to protect us. So that school of thought developed the concept of human rights, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Convention Against Genocide, the Geneva Conventions. They said if we educate people in the ideals of human rights, universal rights of humanity, the universal 10 Commandments, if you will, then we'll be safe. Because the law will protect us. People will follow the law, and they'll do the right thing, and they'll prevent genocide because they'll be obligated to do so. Couldn't convince him through moral argumentation. We couldn't convince him with rabbis marching on Washington. We couldn't convince him by appealing to his better angels. So now we're going to force the Roosevelts of tomorrow, the Churchills of tomorrow, to stand up and defend people like the Jews of Europe by putting together a legal regime of human rights law that is going to protect the victims. The other school of thought was inward looking. They said, we can't change humanity. Human nature is what it is, for better or for worse. People are good, people are evil. That's their business. Our business is to make sure that they don't have the power to hurt us anymore. Our responsibility to the legacy of our victimization is to be strong, is to build our country, to build our army, to ensure that we can defend ourselves, we can protect ourselves. We don't have to ask anybody for any favors. We'll have our army, we'll have our guns. Nobody needs to feel sorry for us. We can take care of ourselves. And that inward-looking response, of course, was a Zionist response. It was a response that actually had been born 80 years before the rise of Hitler, with the dawn of modern Zionism in the 1870s in Europe. And by the time the Holocaust began, the state of Israel was already well on its way to being built. So we had that solution on the ready, and indeed, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, much of the remainder of European Jewry came to the land of Israel on Aliyah, 1948, and of course 1 million Jews who were forced to run away from the Arab lands were able to make their home in Israel as well. And since then, Israel has become, over time, the largest Jewish community now in the world, outstripping the United States in the last decade. There are some 6 million Jews in Israel, and it is the most vibrant Jewish community, the most vibrant Jewish place in the history of the world. More Jews in Israel learning Torah, living a Jewish life, being educated in Jewish history than at any time in our history. Israel is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it is one of the strongest countries in the world. And so I would say that the inward-looking solution has, in the balance, been an extraordinary success. The Jews are in a situation today that we never were in since the destruction of the Second Temple, and we are in a position to defend ourselves in Israel and throughout the world as a result of the power that we have built up for ourselves. Well, what about the world? Where is the world today? Has it changed in the 66 years that have passed since the liberation of the death camps? If so, how? Has the idea that the human rights regime that was instituted in the aftermath of Auschwitz been borne out by events? Do people now feel more of an obligation to defend the weakest people in the world from the stronger ones? No. But as was the situation then, people are very happy to talk about how important it is to do so, as they do nothing, as we saw, for instance, in Rwanda in the 1990s, as we see today in Darfur, in Sudan, as we see today in Syria, with Assad butchering his own people in front of cell phone cameras. And what about the way that the nations of the world look at the Jews? Today, as in the 1930s and 40s, we have full nations. In fact, we have over 50 nations, members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, who are, by and large, in agreement that Israel has to be obliterated, wiped off the map, just as Ahmadinejad has promised to do. We have hundreds of millions of people surrounding Israel who have been raised to believe that it is their duty to bring about the destruction, the annihilation of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. The ideology of the Islamic jihadists and their secular fascist friends is not that different from our perspective than the ideology of the Nazis. The only difference is that they believe that God is telling them to kill us, whereas the Germans believe that the Fuhrer was telling them to kill us. And where is the human rights crowd on this? So as we say in Hebrew, Hagolem Kam al Yotzro, the spirit has risen up against its creator. And we see that the human rights regime that was established by Jews to prevent the Holocaust in response to the Holocaust has now inverted morality and reality and proclaims Israel to be the greatest war criminal in the world. Israel, the only democracy, the only human rights respecting country in the region, is being criminalized and demonized and libeled as the greatest human rights destroying entity on the face of the planet. The country that an embarrassed world had to embrace in the aftermath of the Holocaust is now being demonized in the name of the Holocaust. So the human rights regime that was developed by Jews, in large part, in response to the Holocaust, has now been turned into a weapon in the propaganda war to say that Jews have no right to freedom. And where are the Jews in this argument? I would say that the Jewish people today are extremely confused. We've been told that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, that it is legitimate to have criticisms of Israel, that it is legitimate to have problems with Israel based upon all sorts of ideas of who the land of Israel belongs to. But this is a lie. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is always a little bit tricky. People can always try to figure out a way to tell us that we're just being paranoid. Just tell us, oh, you pushy Jews. Oh, you're so paranoid. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There is no difference between the two. Because anti-Zionism says that Jews alone among the nations of the world have no right to freedom, have no right to self-defense, have no right to a national interest, have no right to defend themselves. And if you don't have any right to defend yourself, and you have hundreds of millions of people calling for your annihilation, you have no right to exist. But we've allowed ourselves to be confused. And so when we hear people say, oh, I'm not an anti-Semite, I don't have a problem with Jews, some of my best friends are Jews, I just don't like Israel, or I don't have a problem with Israel, but those settlers, and you're Judaizing Jerusalem. Is that like New Yorkizing New York? We say, well, maybe Israel's been doing some bad things. Maybe they're right. Maybe we should think about changing our behavior. Maybe there's something that we've done to inspire this hatred. Maybe if we change a little bit, then the hundreds of millions of people who go to their mosques every day and hear their imams calling for the annihilation of Jerusalem, then the Jewish people will change their minds. Maybe the 2 million people in Egypt and Tahrir Square in Cairo who said amen to Yusuf Qaradawi when he said that they were going to march on Jerusalem would change their mind. No, they wouldn't change their mind, because their hatred, their anti-Zionism has nothing to do with what Israel does or does not do. Just as the Nazis' anti-Semitism had nothing to do with the way that Jews comported themselves in Germany. It had to do with their diseased souls. It had to do with their embrace of evil. Nothing to do with us. And yet we twist ourselves into pretzels, trying to figure out a way to explain away their hatred, to make it into something that it isn't, to make it palatable, to make it understandable, to make it something that we can cope with without actually having to do anything about it. And that has to stop. That has to stop. We have to stop trying to develop mechanisms to deny what's happening. That is the lesson of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust is not never again because we're going to convince everybody else to be nice to us. It's hell no. Don't you dare look at us wrong, and don't you talk to us that way, and who do you think you are? Because these Jews are going to prosper today. We're not going to suffer today. We're not going to allow our children to suffer. We're not going to allow our grandchildren to suffer. And if you think we will, you've got another thing coming. You've got another thing coming, because we did learn the lesson of the Holocaust. The lessons of the Holocaust are that good or evil, people aren't going to help us unless they think it's in their interest to do so, which means that the people who have to help us first and foremost are us. It means that the people who have to stand up to the haters first and foremost are us, and it's the people who have to recognize hatred for what it is are us. It's our responsibility to be strong, Our responsibility to say, yes, of course. After Mrs. Lux Brown was liberated from the Holocaust, what was her first ardent dream? It was that somebody should take care of her. And that makes sense. All of us want that. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that to be an adult and to be free means that we take care of ourselves. It means that first and foremost, our responsibility is not to convince other people that it's their responsibility to care about us. It's that our responsibility is to care about us. Our responsibility is to take care of us. Our responsibility is to defend us. Our responsibility is to make the people who want to hurt us pay a price so that they will be deterred from hurting us. That's our responsibility. And all of us have to take on that responsibility because, as I said at the outset, every single one of us is a survivor of the Holocaust. Because it would have happened to all of us. We wouldn't have been born. Our children wouldn't have been born. Our grandchildren wouldn't have been born if they had gotten their way. They wanted to annihilate all of us. And so we all have to take the lesson that it isn't about convincing other people to be better. It's about convincing ourselves to be strong and to take responsibility for ourselves. And to say that not only do we expect to be free, we will fight for it in every generation. We will fight for it for ourselves and for our children and for everybody who didn't have it in the past. Because that's what it means to be part of the Tzror Chaim. That's what it means to be part of Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker. That we all understand that the eternal nature of the Jewish people rests on every single one of our shoulders. And we all have to take it upon ourselves to do everything in our lifetime to ensure that we remain strong and that every single day we get stronger. And every single day we have to ask ourselves, what did we do to strengthen the Jewish people today? Only that way will we ensure never again, and only that way will we ensure that the joy of freedom is our posterity. I was reading the inscription on the wall when I was listening to you speak from Sefer Bereshit. It's what God said to Cain. Kol dmei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama. The blood of your brother calls to me from the earth. And it's telling us to live. And it's telling us to fight. And it's telling us to be strong. And it's telling us to be free. And we should listen. Thank you very much.